Sega gets a little too PC on Segaiden episode 86.
When the first armored vehicles approached Tiananmen Square, people suddenly realized the security forces' deadly intent.
The Tenochtitlan two-step? Nah, it's just the Master System conversion of proto-Metroidvania computer classic Montezuma's Revenge. This is a bit of a strange entry in the Master System pantheon, an upgraded port of a computer game originally hailing from 1984. The game itself is perfectly okay, if a bit dated at this point in the evolution of console gaming. The lack of scrolling between screens certainly pegs it as a somewhat prehistoric work, but it does raise the question of why Montezuma's Revenge? If I had to guess, and that's really all I can do without derailing this weekly series while I try to quixotically hunt down old men about incidental licensing decisions that they made 40 years ago, it would be this. Montezuma's Revenge was the closest thing that they had to a freebie. The Parker Brothers Master System line is a curious little blip in corporate history, which likely accounts for the fact that it ended up being a little messy in hindsight. Parker Brothers had made a concerted push into video gaming during the Atari 2600's heyday, once Activision opened the floodgates for third-party products, a logical extension of the company's nearly century-long history of making toys and games. Some of the most memorable titles for 2600, and 5200, but let's not talk about that, came from Parker Brothers. But when the console industry collapsed in America, Parker Brothers got the heck out of Dodge and abandoned the video game biz altogether. Master System Publishing represented a return to that space after nearly half a decade's absence. Now, if you look over at the madness that was Atari Corp's late 80s console efforts, you'll notice that a lot of what they published on 2600, 7800, and XE Game System amounted to carryovers from before the crash. Parker Brothers probably would have done that too, bringing some of those classic games to Sega's console, except that pretty much everything Parker Brothers had put on 2600 was either licensed from other game developers, Konami mainly, or else based on external media properties like James Bond and Star Wars. Montezuma's Revenge was one of the games that Parker Brothers put out there, and it was a rare exception to their rule. A computer game published by a little-known studio that didn't have a publishing license on NES by the time that Parker Brothers made their way back to console gaming. As it happens, Parker Brothers had bought the rights to Montezuma's Revenge outright back in the day. According to an interview with the developers at GDRI, while Parker Brothers was hoovering up contemporary computer properties to put on Master System, Montezuma's Revenge was an older computer game that Parker Brothers already owned and didn't have to pay a license fee for. And best of all, its action-oriented design and nonlinear structure felt a lot less dated and more like a natural fit for Master System than most of Parker Brothers' other software for 2600 would have seemed. Heck, fundamentally, Montezuma's Revenge resembles Castle Quest, a game that Sega courageously published on the NES at around the same time. Montezuma's Revenge has a slightly smaller game world, but it also has a much less gloopy feel to its controls, and generally is more enjoyable to play. So score 1 for the Master System. This Master System port carries forward the design of the computer original pretty faithfully. The game takes place in a series of Mesoamerican pyramids, each built from a set of prefab rooms, but arranged in increasingly complex layouts as they grow steadily larger and present players with increasingly harsh hazards. The first pyramid is relatively small and filled with basic traps, but beginning with the second pyramid, you have to navigate larger spaces while avoiding new dangers like bats that home in on protagonist Panama Joe if he lingers on a single screen for too long. The rooms in the pyramids each fit within a single screen, which means there's no scrolling, probably the element that again ages the game the most. That, and the fact that Panama Joe has a very spelunker-like vulnerability to heights. Montezuma's Revenge is a very difficult game, but the bulk of deaths in a given run come from the fact that the hero dies instantly if he drops or jumps from a height higher than his own head. You can forget your dreams of a successful run until you get a handle on Joe's limitations and the quirks of the platforming physics, especially the way that you can pass through thin platforms in some contexts, but need to treat them as hard barriers in others. And once you start working your way through stages patrolled by vampire bats, you don't have the luxury of waiting around and working up the nerve to make jumps along a series of tiny footholds. It's go, go, go at all times. Montezuma's Revenge also presents you with a hard limitation in that Joe has a very limited personal inventory. You can collect 2 categories of objects in Montezuma's Revenge as you plunder the sacred graves of indigenous peoples in a sovereign nation, tools and treasure. Treasures transmit instantly into points upon contact, requiring no inventory space and imposing no encumbrance. Tools, on the other hand, have to be dragged around and accounted for, and you can only tote about half a dozen at a time. And tools cover a lot of ground. They can be passive items like torches that automatically light dark rooms in the lower depths of the pyramid. They can be auto-triggered consumables, like the sabers that will destroy a single foe on contact, then immediately disappear. They can be active items, like the indecipherable sprites that you can use to freeze enemies once. And tools also include keys, which you need to collect a ton of, in several different varieties, in order to open locked doors and advance further into each pyramid. Since you can only hold a few tools at once, this means you have to make hard choices from time to time. Do you surrender an item that will help you survive the pyramid's hazards in order to snatch a key that you need in order to advance? Conversely, do you pass up a key that you won't need immediately in order to load up on defensive items? Montezuma's Revenge holds up respectably to the ravages of time. It's not exactly cutting edge for 1989, but certainly other publishers were putting worse materials out there, like the Master System version of King's Quest. Finally, after all the oddball takes on the adventure genre that we've seen on Master System, the real thing arrives at last. King's Quest is still, in many ways, the original, which isn't to say necessarily the best. With King's Quest I, Parker Brothers takes a bold stance, making an effort to bring a text-driven graphical adventure to a console with 2 buttons. Now, that concept wasn't entirely alien at this point. It had been 4 years since Chunsoft adapted Portopio Renzoku Satsujin Jiken to Famicom. Not that I imagine that the Master System conversion team at Microsmiths had played Portopia for Famicom, but the knowledge of how to make such a thing existed in the world at this point, floating out there in the video ether, available to all who dared seek it. And Parker Brothers had already done something along these lines on Master System with Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? But King's Quest wasn't precisely the same kind of game in its original IBM PC Junior incarnation as those other games had been. Yes, it made use of a text parser interface, but you also had control over a little guy named Graham, who wandered around graphical environments and interacted directly with things. Graham in the original computer game functioned as a sort of ambulatory cursor, trotting along to look at, interact with, or collect objects in the field as you issued commands. This introduced a layer of additional complexity to the design of the game and bringing it over to consoles, and Microsmiths played to the platform's strengths by giving players direct control over Graham in this case. Parker Brothers, or rather developers Base 2, had done something similar for Carmen Sandiego, but in this case the move to a direct control approach required less of a reinvention than turning a strictly menu-based adventure into a character action adventure had. Rather than type commands in order to maneuver Graham around the screen, you just guide him here directly with the D-pad. The massive design overhaul, in this case, instead comes from the question of how to integrate a text parser into such a setup. For Carmen Sandiego, Base 2 had crammed the action into the upper screen while using the lower half as a contextual text display that would change as players moved around to different points of interest. This isn't actually too far removed from the original setup of King's Quest. The bottom of the screen on the computer game contained a black window where players could input text commands and receive written feedback to point them toward important elements or alert them to impending danger. Microsmiths abandoned this screen design in favor of devoting the entire screen real estate to, well, real estate. As Graham moves around, you don't see any written information at all. If you want to interact with on-screen elements or get a more guided sense of your surroundings, you need to press a button. Both buttons 1 and 2 bring up different menus, which can be a little confusing at first. Button 1 pulls up a large menu of common general commands, like take, look around, and so forth. Button 2, on the other hand, activates a contextual menu that provides the functionality of the PC game's text parser. It gives you a pair of word lists with eligible verbs in the left word wheel and valid nouns in the right. Once you figure out how to navigate it, which doesn't take too long, it allows you to input commands and try out combinations of terms without requiring you to make random guesses as to which words the program might recognize at any given moment. It's actually a little bit like the menu system in Lucasfilm games' Scum titles, although this of course is a Sierra adventure, so that almost feels like heresy. The keyword-based menu approach also resembles the one in Final Fantasy II for Famicom, but I feel pretty comfortable in saying that this constitutes a massive coincidence. The Microsmiths team had almost certainly seen Maniac Mansion in action, but I can't imagine that import Famicom RPGs comprised much of their gaming diets. Overall, the setup works pretty well. It's clumsy, yes, but not that much clumsier than Chunsoft's Portopia solution. Any attempt to bring a parser-based adventure to a 2-button console controller had to contend with the realities of interface scaling. And honestly, Microsmiths handled it with respectable aplomb. The only real problem with King's Quest on Master System is that, well, it's King's Quest. When people think back on how bloodthirsty Sierra's adventures were in comparison to Lucasfilm's Scum adventures, they're very likely thinking of King's Quest. Graham's life is a brief, fragile thing, especially where water is concerned. You can die within seconds of starting a new game by wandering into a river and drowning instantly. I gave up on my recording run for this episode when I walked north from one screen, where a narrow river receded into the distance, only to find that somehow the scene transition caused the river to expand its width to fill most of the screen, causing Graham to step right into it, instantly killing him and my enthusiasm for the game without any sort of warning. Like Alex Kidd High Tech World, King's Quest expects the player to commit to painful trial and error in order to learn the many untelegraphed ways in which your quest can end instantly. It's more painful here because King's Quest is a much bigger and more complex effort, asking you to track down 3 mystical treasures in a kingdom populated by dragons, gnomes, thieves, and wolves. I would go so far as to argue that no Master System adventure or role-playing game contained quite as much unfair, game-ending BS as King's Quest. That makes it a faithful rendition of the source material, to be sure, but it also kind of feels like they were bullying the 80s kids. What did Xennials ever do to you, Sega? But Sega wasn't totally indifferent to our suffering. This seems like the proper time to mention the existence of Sega's hint sheets, which, based on the scan archive at Sega Retro, appears to have come to an end here with King's Quest. Throughout the pre-Genesis Master System's existence, frustrated players could reach out to Sega for help, and rather than simply being guided through a tough spot by a game counselor on a $1.50 per minute 900 line, they'd receive in the mail a printed tip sheet that gave useful advice, shared codes, and sometimes even included crude ASCII maps. You'll sometimes find these tucked into the manuals of used Master System games. Sega produced these little guides for dozens of games, stretching all the way back to launch titles like Fantasy Zone and My Hero. Surprisingly, the tip sheet for My Hero didn't simply read, "Play something better, kid." King's Quest doesn't simply mark the end of Sega's tip sheets, it also marks the end of Parker Brothers' brief run as a Master System publisher. 3 games ain't much, but nevertheless, Sega's first third-party partner bows out here. That's not actually a bad sign for Sega or Master System. In fact, I'd argue that it means things are finally looking up. Not only was Sega about to introduce its most successful console ever in America, it also had begun to reacquire US distribution rights for its existing console from Tonka. After about a year and a half of half-heartedly peddling the Master System in North America, Tonka had utterly failed to make headway against the Nintendo juggernaut. So Sega sighed and decided to go back to doing it themselves, distributing the Master System as a first-party product again for the remaining 2 years of the console's life. Although that didn't really give the Master System a second wind, and it certainly didn't beat back Nintendo's domination of the 8-bit market in America, it did allow Sega to position the Master System as a low-cost companion to Genesis, similar to how Atari had approached the 2600 and 7800, but more coherently. That's where you see things like the Master System 2 redesign and the aforementioned power-based converter with its bonus free Master System games offer. And the final run of Sega's Master System releases would include some of the strongest titles of the console's life on top of that. But that does mean that Parker Brothers went away from the Sega camp because Parker Brothers was a division of Tonka. And the Parker Brothers trio of releases was almost certainly one of Tonka's half-hearted measures to do something, anything, with the console that they were theoretically trying to sell. Tonka had absorbed Parker Brothers in 1987 as part of their larger acquisition of Kenner, which had in turn come into possession of Parker Brothers in 1985 when parent company General Mills spun both entities into a single corporation. Yeah. When Tonka picked up Master System, someone at the toy company evidently realized, hey, our Parker Brothers division used to do video games. And so Parker Brothers became Master System's first third-party publisher, except not really because at the time Parker Brothers' parent corporation distributed Master System, meaning they were kind of as much of a first-party relative as Sega? However you want to parse it, Sega moved in to take over again around this time. It was really the impossible dream of the 1980s latchkid key come true. Mom and dad are getting back together again. I mean, not your actual mom and dad. There's no coming back from that whole thing with his secretary and the camcorder and all those turkey basters. But for a generation who had imprinted on video games in place of absent biological parents, it was the next best thing. Sega Challenge did not cover either of these games editorially, although both did show up in some Parker Brothers ads, which I guess was kind of indistinguishable from a Sega Challenge article. So, in a sense, I guess you could say they enjoyed prime coverage. Next time on Segaiden, 8 is enough if we're talking in terms of bits.